In the spring of 1945, a Soviet general looked at an American threat and laughed. He shouldn't have. Because what General Georges Patton was about to do, or rather what he was planning to do, would have rewritten the entire Cold War before it even began. And for decades the full story was buried, classified, hidden from the public on both sides of the Iron Curtain. This is the moment history almost went in a completely different direction. May 1945. The guns in Europe have barely gone silent. Adolf Hitler is dead. Berlin is rubble. The Nazi war machine has collapsed. And the soldiers of the Allied forces are shaking hands, taking photographs, and celebrating what they believe is the end of everything. But in a command tent somewhere in Bavaria, one American general is not celebrating. He's making plans. And those plans have nothing to do with going home. General Georges Patton, the most feared battlefield commander the Americans had ever produced, is sitting across from maps of Eastern Europe. And the enemy he's staring at isn't German. It's Soviet. What most people don't know is that Patton had already begun quietly preparing his staff. Not for peacetime. Not for occupation duty. For war. A new war. One that his own government had absolutely no idea he was seriously considering. And here's where it gets stranger. He wasn't alone in thinking it. To understand what Patton was planning, you have to understand what he was seeing, because what Patton witnessed in the final weeks of World War II terrified him in a way that no German panzer division ever had. As American and Soviet forces linked up along the Elbe River in late April 1945, Patton got his first real extended look at the Red Army. Not through intelligence reports. Not through diplomatic cables. Face to face. And what he saw alarmed him deeply. The Soviets weren't just an army. They were a machine. Hardened by 4 years of the most brutal warfare in human history. Tens of millions dead on the Eastern Front alone. These were soldiers who had fought through Stalingrad, through Kursk, through the gates of Berlin itself. And they had won. They were also moving. Not stopping. Not standing down. Just moving. Westward. Into countries they had liberated. Setting up governments. Installing loyal officials. Pulling the Iron Curtain down, one nation at a time. Patton watched this and reached a conclusion that was absolutely rational, and absolutely explosive. The war isn't over. It just changed sides. But what happened next shocked everyone who knew him. He said it out loud. Patton began making statements, to his staff, to journalists, to anyone who would listen, that were, by any diplomatic standard, completely unhinged. He called the Soviets the real enemy. He suggested that the United States had fought the wrong people. He argued that the American army, right now, today, while it was still in Europe and still armed and still battle-hardened, could push the Soviets back behind their own borders. His exact words, recorded by multiple witnesses, "We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Why not do it now while our army is intact and the damn Russians can still be kicked back into Russia?" Washington was horrified. Eisenhower was furious. And the Soviets? The Soviets were paying very close attention. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to subscribe, because the ending reveals something most history books barely mention, something that changes how you see the entire early Cold War. Now here's what makes this story extraordinary. Patton wasn't just talking. His staff, acting on his guidance, had actually begun preliminary planning. They were quietly assessing Soviet positions, identifying logistical choke points, looking at which roads, which bridges, which rail lines would matter if the order ever came. Patton believed, genuinely believed, that the American army in the summer of 1945 had a narrow window, a fleeting moment where it could actually win a war against the Soviet Union in Europe. And he might not have been entirely wrong. Here's the military reality that nobody wants to talk about. In the summer of 1945, the United States Army in Europe was the most powerful conventional fighting force on the planet. It had more experienced officers, better logistics, superior air power, and, this is crucial, the atomic bomb. The Soviets had none of those. Their army was massive and battle-hardened, yes. But it was also exhausted, undersupplied, and operating at the absolute edge of its logistical limits. Patton's window was real. Narrow but real. There was a specific Soviet general who knew this too. And that general had a very different read on Patton than everyone else did. His name was Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the most decorated and feared Soviet commander of the entire war. The man who had defended Moscow, broken the siege of Leningrad, commanded at Stalingrad, and personally led the final assault on Berlin. Zhukov had met Patton. They had attended the same ceremonies, sat at the same tables, shaken hands in front of photographers. And Zhukov, according to Soviet records and the accounts of his aides, had developed a specific assessment of Patton that he shared privately. He believed Patton was the most dangerous man in the Allied command. Not Eisenhower. Not Bradley. Not Montgomery. Patton. Zhukov reportedly told his inner circle that Patton was the only American general who thought the way Soviet generals thought, who understood maneuver warfare, who was willing to take risks that other commanders would never accept. But then, and this is the part that changes everything, Zhukov added something else. He said Patton would never get the order. And that's where things took an unexpected turn. Zhukov's confidence didn't come from underestimating Patton. It came from understanding American politics. He had done his homework. He knew that Harry Truman had just inherited the presidency and was desperately trying to maintain the alliance that had won the war. He knew that American public opinion was overwhelmingly in favor of bringing the boys home. He knew that the U.S. Congress had no appetite whatsoever for another war, especially one against a country that had just lost 27 million people fighting on the same side as America. Zhukov understood that Patton's war would never happen. Not because Patton lacked the will. Not because the military couldn't do it. But because the politics made it impossible. And so when Soviet intelligence briefed Zhukov on Patton's inflammatory statements, on the planning sessions on the war talk, Zhukov reportedly shrugged. He thought Patton was bluffing. Or rather, and this is the crucial distinction, he thought it didn't matter whether Patton was bluffing or not. Because Patton wasn't in charge. Politicians were. He was right. But only barely. Because what Zhukov didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was how close it had actually come. There is a document. It's called Operation Unthinkable. And it wasn't American. It was British. In May 1945, the exact same weeks that Patton was making his incendiary statements, Winston Churchill, deeply alarmed by Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe, secretly ordered his military chiefs to draw up a war plan. A real one. With objectives. Timelines. Force requirements. The plan called for a surprise attack on Soviet forces in Germany. July 1, 1945 was the target date. 47 British and American divisions supported by rearmed German Wehrmacht units. Yes, you read that correctly, German soldiers fighting alongside the Allies again, just weeks after the Nazi surrender, would strike east. The goal? Force the Soviets back. Liberate Poland. Prevent the Iron Curtain from falling. When Churchill's military chiefs finished their assessment, they handed it back to him with a stark conclusion. The operation was, as the title suggested, unthinkable. The math didn't work. The Soviets had overwhelming numerical superiority. Even with air power and better logistics, the Allies couldn't sustain an offensive deep enough to achieve the political objectives without the very real risk of catastrophic losses, possibly including nuclear escalation if the bomb were used. Churchill shelved it. Classified it so deeply that the British public wouldn't learn about it for 50 years. But here's what makes Patton's story intersect so dramatically with Operation Unthinkable. Patton never knew the plan existed. He was thinking the same thoughts, reaching the same conclusions, entirely independently. Separated by the English Channel and a complete absence of coordination. Two men, worlds apart in personality and background, staring at the same map and seeing the same threat. And yet, both were stopped by the same thing. By the autumn of 1945, Patton had become a genuine liability. His statements were getting worse. He compared the Nazi Party to the Republican and Democratic parties. He resisted denazification policies. He was pulling headlines away from everything the Allied leadership was trying to accomplish diplomatically. Eisenhower relieved him of command of the Third Army. Patton was furious. He felt humiliated. He told his diary, and his diary was astonishingly candid, that he believed he was being silenced. That the people in charge were either naive about Soviet intentions or, worse, actively compromised by pro-Soviet sympathies within the Allied command structure. He was preparing to go public. He was planning to return to the United States, resign his commission, and then speak freely. No more chains of command. No more diplomatic constraints. He would go directly to the American people. And then, on December 9, 1945, just days before he was scheduled to leave Europe forever, Patton was involved in a car accident. It was, by all accounts, a low-speed collision. The kind of fender-bender that people walk away from every day. His driver was unhurt. The other vehicle's occupants were unhurt. Patton's neck snapped. He was paralyzed from the neck down. 12 days later, on December 21, 1945, George S. Patton died in his sleep in a hospital in Heidelberg, Germany. He was 60 years old. He never gave that speech. The conspiracy theories, of course, came immediately. And they have never fully gone away. The accident was suspicious in ways that have fueled speculation ever since. There were questions about the other vehicle. A military truck that seemed to appear from nowhere and then disappeared from official records. Questions about why Patton, one of the most carefully guarded figures in the Allied command, was riding without his usual security detail. Questions about the medical care he received, and why a man who seemed to be recovering showed sudden and unexpected deterioration. In 2008, a biography by Robert Wilcox called Target, Patton made the extraordinary claim that an OSS operative named Douglas Bazata had confessed, on his deathbed, to orchestrating the crash on orders from Wild Bill Donovan, the head of American intelligence, at the request of parties who wanted Patton silenced. The claim has never been proven. The OSS files from that period remain to this day partially classified. What is documented, what is not in dispute, is the timing. Patton was about to go home and tell the American public things that powerful people on multiple sides did not want said. And he never got the chance. So what do we make of it all? Here is what the history actually shows, stripped of conspiracy and sentiment. George Patton saw something real. The Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe was not incidental. It was strategic, methodical, and permanent. The nations that fell behind the Iron Curtain, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, would spend the next 45 years under Soviet domination. Millions of lives shaped by exactly the outcome Patton was trying to prevent. Zhukov was right that the political will didn't exist for what Patton was proposing. But Patton was right that the threat was real. And the window, that narrow, fleeting military window that Patton could see so clearly in the summer of 1945, did close. Permanently. Within 4 years the Soviets had their own atomic bomb. The moment passed and never came back. Whether Patton's war would have been worth fighting, whether it would have saved more lives than it cost, is a question that historians still cannot agree on. But this much is certain. One general thought Patton was bluffing. Another thought Patton was dangerous but controllable. And one American military genius, perhaps the only man in the Allied command willing to say what he actually saw, died in a hospital bed in Germany before he could tell the world what he believed. History is full of roads not taken. But few are as haunting as this one. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If Patton had lived, if he had come home, resigned, and spoken openly to the American public, would it have changed anything? Would the Cold War have unfolded differently? Or were the forces of diplomacy, politics, and public exhaustion simply too powerful for one man to move, no matter how loudly he shouted? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story made you see the end of World War II differently, if you want to keep uncovering the moments that history almost forgot, subscribe. Because we're just getting started.